Welcome to this virtual event, live from nomadlife.tv at our studios in Montreal. I'm your host, Jason Rohde, and today we'll be exploring how to select the optimal PFAS removal technology. On the webpage where you're watching this video, you'll find a chat box where you're able to write your questions and we'll be able to ask them to today's presenters on your behalf. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Martin Bureau, VP of Innovation at Sanexen, who will be discussing robust and economical processes for the treatment of PFAS. Then, Tim Cansler, a government relations and strategic communications consultant, will explain the legislative and regulatory outlook for PFAS in the US's 117th Congress. And finally, Jennifer Bailey, VP of Business Development at Sanexen, will describe ALTRA's ultimate approach to current PFAS challenges. Now, beginning with Martin Bureau, presentation of robust and economical processes for the treatment of PFAS. Since joining the Sanexen team in 2013, Martin Bureau has made his mark, heading up the R&D and engineering team. Under his leadership, Sanexen was awarded significant grants for the technological demonstration of 3 Sanexen technologies: ALTRA-proven water technologies, ALTRA-proven PFAS solutions, and Sanexen's new value-add transformation technology for construction and demolition of fine residues. He has authored more than 200 scientific journal articles and international conference reviews, and is co-author of more than 20 patents. Today, he and his team are spearheading Sanexen's ALTRA-proven solutions, tackling the most important water challenges facing cities across North America. He continues to drive research to incorporate science and technology into ensuring everyone has clean drinking water for generations to come. Dr. Martin Bureau, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for the great introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. We're glad to have you with us. I hope you're safe and sound wherever you are. Today, we're here to talk about PFAS. What are PFAS? Should we care about PFAS? And if we should, how come we ended up in a situation like this? First of all, PFAS are toxic. They're toxic at minute dosage. Dosage so small that it's difficult for us to grasp, to understand. They call it part per trillion, PPT. Toxicity levels have been reported for PFAS as low as a concentration that equivalates to a few tablespoons into a large NFL football stadium, like the new Dallas Cowboys Stadium. That's how small a dose of PFAS can be toxic to us. And they act like hormones, and that's why they're so toxic. They will mess up the communications between cells and organs in our body. They have an effect on our metabolism. They affect our fertility levels. They are linked to birth defects. They will affect the development of our infants, both intellectually and physically. They are linked to cancers, kidney cancers, for example, liver cancers. They mess up our immune system. So we should really care about those. And they are there, they are like that because they were meant this way by men. In the 50s, we developed PFAS for all sorts of great industrial applications, whether it's for fabrics, textile, fire suppressants, all sorts of industrial applications that are very useful. But by design, we made them extremely stable. So stable that they will not degrade in nature. There is no biodegradation pathways known in nature for PFAS. So when we produce them and introduce them into the market, we actually introduce them into the environment. So they accumulate. And they accumulate wherever there is water. Since we're made of water, they accumulate into us, in our children, in our blood. It's everywhere on Earth, from North Pole to South Pole, in the food chain, in the crops, in the water. So it's a real big deal that we should take care of. You may ask, is it too late to do something? And if it's not, then we do something affordably, economically. effectively? The answers to those last questions are yes. We certainly can deal with them. And I feel so strongly about that, not only because we came up with great solutions, I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute, but because of our track record. At Sanexen, for 35 years, we've been dealing with situations like this. Never before solved issues, environmental issues, that is. In the 80s, when we started, we were dealing with PCBs, dioxin and furans. No one knew what to do with those, how to treat them. And we cleaned more of PCBs than anyone else in Canada, more economically and more effectively than ever. At one point, there was not even enough PCBs for us to clean, so we turned ourselves to other issues like DNAPL, chlorinated solvents. To this day, we've treated almost 3 billion gallons of water contaminated by those products, more than anyone else in Canada. In the 90s, we listening to our clients that were facing huge infrastructure issues on their potable water infrastructure, that is. We came up with great solutions to help those clients deal with the lead they had in the water, the cracks they had in their pipe that led to contamination of the potable water. And today, under ALTRA water technologies, we have installed those technologies and relined and renewed pipelines in more than 350 cities in the States and in Canada, in 1,300 miles of pipeline. We even made those solutions one of the most resilient solutions for pipeline there is on the market, even against earthquakes. That's what we do at Sanexen. We go beyond. And so it's with that background in mind, that track record, that I feel very confident that we can deal with the PFAS crisis. So let's dive right into solutions and the issue, the PFAS problem. Thank you. So what are mainstream approaches of our PFAS and how can we treat them? People have been using granular activated carbon, ion exchange resins, and membrane technologies. Those are methods that work. They will be effective to some extent, but they come to a price. They have a serious challenge on price, especially for high concentration in PFAS in water. For GAC, for example, will be effective. It's known to probably treat up to 99% of the PFAS in water, but it will have limited life. It will saturate rapidly. It's sensitive to fouling. So it depends on what you have in the water. When you have high concentration PFAS in the water, thousands or hundreds of thousands of PPT, you don't have only PFAS in the water. You have a soup, a chemical soup, and your GAC is going to be affected by that soup. So recent example published in a firefighting training area, they had very high concentrations in PFAS, close to 1 million PPT, actually 600,000 PPT. So microgram here is 1,000 PPT, so a lot, 600,000 PPT. PFAS were removed effectively in that study, as they reported, up to 99%. But to reach that 99% for their 11,000 gallons in the study, they had to use, and they were shooting for the customer's guidelines for water quality, they had to use 5,000 pounds of GAC. That's a lot of GAC. Imagine the volumes. That's a lot of trucks. So logically speaking, it's a challenge. And that comes to a price, up to close to $1 per gallon. That's very expensive for water treatment. So obviously their conclusion was that it's effective, but it's expensive. The other example are ion exchange resins. They are effective as well, although you need to choose the right resins. Not all resins will work for all PFASs. So you need to be careful about that. But vendors know what they're doing and you'll have probably the right resins. Now, if you did your homework right, you still will have a limited life, probably better than what you have with GAC, but still it will saturate quite rapidly. So expect perhaps 3 times the efficiency of a GAC treatment. Those resins will be sensitive to fouling and other bacteriological effects. So that's something to be careful or mindful of. For high concentration PFAS levels, 10,000 ppt, you still can estimate your pricing to be 50 cents to even more per gallon. That's quite expensive by all means also. The last examples are water membrane technologies. Membrane technologies work great. They are effective. They are effective for a wide range of contaminants, not only PFAS, but they generate waste stream of highly concentrated PFAS. And in the end, the idea is to get rid of those streams. So it may not be the best approach, or at least it poses some challenges from a management and treatment perspective downstream. You also need to be careful and mindful of the problems related to membrane technologies, especially reverse osmosis, regarding corrosion issues in your downstream treatments because of the problem that are known associated to that technology. In general, these technologies are considered the costliest among all the technologies for PFAS because of the price tag on CapEx and energy demand, especially for high flow rates and high concentration in PFAS. So for ALTRA Water Solutions, we have set ourselves two clear goals, simple goals. You may switch slides. Be more cost effective, be robust, bring economies to our client, first set of objective. And the second, fewer filter changes, reduce the frequency of media replacement, ease the pain on the logistics. So PFAS ALTRA PFAS treatment approach goes like this. You've got your water contaminated by PFAS. You may have a preliminary treatment for dealing with suspended matter, oil and grease and whatnot. But then we get to the heart of our treatment, heart of our technology. It's the conditioning and extraction phase. Essentially, what we do is we condition the water that's impacted by PFAS with a media or liquid that will in turn be attracted or captured by absorption appropriatory media. If we did our homeworks right, we remove most of the PFAS and then we get to a polishing state. That polishing state will be based on carbon, resin, our own media. It depends on the water. But in the end, the goal is to get longer operational life, less media replacement, lower operational costs. And that is our commitment. We'll shoot for 50% less cost probably. So we are all eager to listen to our colleague and friend, Tim Cansler, about what's coming in terms of a regulatory perspective. So I'm going to be quick on the examples, but I'm going to choose two important ones, large-scale demonstrations based on modular containerized unit that we deployed to our client site. One comes from a fire training area site. The wastewater came from an airport. And I put in red the concentration in PFAS. According to what we've read and we looked, that's probably the highest concentrations that we've seen reported in terms of PFAS treatment. So we had close to 2 million ppt in the water, 1.7 million nanograms per liter or ppt. We treated 45,000 gallons and reached a removal rate of 99.8%. So you see the results. Not all PFAS were treated the same way, but we were able globally to take from close to 2 million down to 3,000 ppt, the amount of going through the first stage. Obviously, the benefits of this treatment from an economical point of view are obvious. The second example, I should say, is at the other end of the spectrum. You're talking here about groundwater from a municipal water treatment. The sum of PFAS reported here, regulated by the state where we were, are around 50 ppt, 46 actually. The sum of all was just below 100. We treated 300,000 gallons or close to water at that site. And we were able to get every single PFAS noted in the water down to detection limits and below. So that's how effective and robust our treatment is. From 2 million to 100 ppt, and getting, astonishingly high efficiency treatment levels. So we even add a new capability to our lab, where we recently purchased a LC-MS equipment. Perhaps people are not familiar with those, but this is the type of equipment that you need to analyze PFAS in water. So we decided to buy our own because we needed speed, we needed agility, we needed to turn around quicker than we were using the labs we work with. We're great, they're great, we need them. We're not offering that service commercially speaking, but we need to answer our client faster. So we get a turnaround time in 24 hours if we need to. That's going to be a great tool for us to use answering to our client, as I said. And it's operational now. So we moved on this quite recently, but everything works now and ready to go. So in a nutshell, as a conclusion, you may go to the next slide, Jason. The saturation and economics of this treatment is very good. Let's use an example where you have high concentration PFAS in water, 1,000, 10,000 ppt. GAC media in consumables only will be close to $1 per gallon for treating the water. Now you need to consider also the cost of the media when you use it. So it's going to cost you $7 to $8 per gallon of vessel. That's to fill your vessel. In resin media, well, in consumable, it may cost half of that price, 50 cents, 60 cents a gallon. But to fill up that vessel, it's going to cost you $50, $60 per gallon. So that's something to consider. Now, our solution will be at least 50% less of those prices. And to fill up the vessel, it's going to be even more advantageous. And we're even working on a regeneration of the media to make it even more beneficial to our clients. So that's where we're going now. So I love that slide. You see, PFAS everywhere. It's actually depressing, but still a great slide. The plant, the landfills, the biosolids goes to the crop. Then we harvest, then we eat it. Then it's in the water, the groundwater, we drink it. So it's everywhere. We need to regulate this. It's very important. We may not like it, but it's a necessary thing that we are doing. And there are increasing measures, regulatory measures on PFAS that are coming our way from the EPA, from Congress. And Tim Cansler is going to tell all about what we can expect from the new administration and the EPA. Thank you very much. And Tim, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Martin. Now, Tim Cansler, our government relations and strategic communications consultant, will explain the legislative and regulatory outlook for PFAS in the U.S.'s 117th Congress. With over 3 decades of experience in the federal policy arena, Tim Cansler has held a variety of positions in government and the private sector. Prior to founding Cansler Consulting, Tim worked at the United States Department of Agriculture. There he worked on multiple domestic and international issues with jurisdiction across multiple government agencies. He assisted in the administration and management of 4 agencies with nearly 15,000 employees, located in all 50 states, 4 territories, and around the world, administering multiple billions of dollars in government programs. From 1995 to 2002, Tim served as a congressional affairs executive for the largest trade association in Washington, serving the food and agriculture industry, where he managed the association's federal government affairs and communications programs. Tim also served on the professional staff of 2 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, serving on the Agriculture and Armed Services Committee and Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs Committee. As Cansler Consulting, Tim assists multiple clients as they pursue their policy, regulatory, and legislative objectives with key officials at the White House, members of various congressional committees, and executive branch agencies. Mr. Cansler, welcome, sir.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jason. I really appreciate it, and it's a pleasure to be with the innovative professionals of Sanexen this morning and hear more about their ALTRA proven solutions for PFAS. For my portion of the program this morning, I want to speak with you about the legislative and regulatory outlook for PFAS in the 117th session of Congress. And I want to start today with giving you a brief understanding of just how Congress is functioning in the 117th session, as members are operating under tight majorities in both the House and the Senate. Now, in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Democrats are in the majority with 220 members. It takes 218 votes to pass legislation in the House, so Democratic leaders can only afford to lose 2 members of their caucus on priority legislation that they bring before the House. So the Democratic leaders have their hands full in managing their caucus on every issue that comes before the U.S. House. In the Senate, there are 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and 2 independents that choose to caucus with Democrats. Democrats are in the majority because Vice President Kamala Harris serves as the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. Now that means that Democrats control the legislative agenda and issues brought up before committees and the full Senate. But what some of you might not know is that the Senate has organized itself with equal division on every committee. So the Republicans and Democrats have an equal number of members on each committee. And this equal division encourages members of both political parties to actually work together. I know, a novel thing in Washington, right? In the Senate, most legislation requires 60 votes to end the debate. But however, there is a rule where the very slim majority may use a special budget consideration. It's known as budget reconciliation, and it allows the Senate to pass certain bills addressing spending and revenue provisions with just a simple majority vote. Now, previously, Republicans when they were in the majority, they used budget reconciliation to pass tax cuts. And the most recent use of budget reconciliation was by the Democrats when they passed the COVID-19 stimulus package earlier this month. And based on what we're hearing, I believe that budget reconciliation process is going to be used repeatedly wherever possible throughout the 117th Congress to move Democrats' priority legislation. So here on your screen are, I think, 3 fundamental takeaways about how Congress is currently functioning and what it means to the outlook for PFAS legislation. First, bipartisan legislation beginning in the political center and gaining support outward, it's going to have the highest percentage chance of being enacted in a closely divided Congress. Second, the use of budget reconciliation by the majority party in the U.S. Senate is going to be used repetitively to move important legislation. And then finally, I think in order for members of Congress to pass their individual PFAS legislative initiatives, they're going to need to incorporate those provisions into larger must-pass legislation like they have in previous Congresses in bills like the National Defense Authorization Act, or what we call the NDAA, or in the annual appropriations bills that provide the discretionary funding for the federal government agencies. So as this slide shows, we're going to look at how members have recently used these large must-pass bills to pass PFAS legislation. Based on studies conducted by the Department of Defense, the military's use of aqueous firefighting foam that contains PFAS has increased the number of military installations that have PFAS contamination. So federal lawmakers that introduce standalone PFAS legislation are targeting must-pass annual NDAAs as a vehicle to enact their PFAS legislation. Lawmakers have incorporated their PFAS provisions in the NDAA at least since 2018. And here on your screen are just a few examples of some of the provisions that they included in last year's NDAA. As Martin mentioned earlier, the Department of Defense must now notify agricultural operations that are located in areas exposed to PFAS use. Congress urged the Secretary of Defense to maximize transparency and public disclosure of environmental testing results for PFAS substances on military installations, and also formally use defense site. And Congress also added $30 million to study health effects of PFAS exposure of members of the armed forces. On the next slide, using the annual appropriations bills, in Washington, you can pretty much follow the money and find out the policy ideas that lawmakers are proposing and supporting. In last year's appropriations bills, lawmakers used this must-pass legislation to add and redirect funding to EPA's PFAS action plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But these added funds and redirected funds, they went to $17.5 million from other EPA programs to EPA's PFAS action plan. They redirected $6.5 million from EPA's toxic review and risk prevention account to the PFAS action plan. Congress added $20 million to EPA's research and development priorities under the PFAS action plan. And they also added $2.7 million for research on the transition or transmission of PFOA and PFAS in watersheds and aquifers. And they also added $2.5 million for Superfund remediation. And Congress also used the appropriations process to urge EPA to act expeditiously on their PFAS action plan and to remediate Superfund sites and research toxicology of PFAS. Now, many members of Congress in the U.S. House introduced legislation in the last session of Congress and in order to try to address PFAS. As we saw in previous slides, some of those provisions were enacted into law and there were others that were not acted into law. This has led many bipartisan members of Congress to make PFAS legislation a priority in the 117th Congress. In fact, 9 days after the inauguration of President Biden on January the 29th, 132 Republican and Democratic members on the Congressional PFAS Task Force, led by Congressman Dan Kildee from Michigan and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, a Democrat and a Republican, respectively, they sent a letter to President Biden. And in this letter, they identified 9 actions that the administration can take on PFAS. 2 important actions identified in their letter were creating a nationwide drinking water standard for PFAS and listing PFAS as a hazardous substance. Also, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan, she co-authored H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Plan. And the PFAS Action Plan passed the U.S. House of Representatives in January of 2020. And it passed by a vote of 247 to 159. And it included some help from 24 Republican members. Some of the main provisions in H.R. 535 included designation of PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances, testing all PFAS substances, the creation of the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations for PFAS, and the establishment of PFAS infrastructure grant programs. Over in the Senate, I'm watching the legislation that's currently being drafted by Senators Kirsten Gillibrand of New York and Shelley Moore Capito, the ranking Republican member on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And these 2 senators previously worked on the Protect Drinking Water for PFAS Act in the last Congress, and they reached agreement on things like EPA publishing a maximum contaminant level and national primary drinking water regulations for PFAS. They found agreement on PFAS monitoring that was tailored to public water systems. And they also agreed on technical assistance for water systems to comply with the national primary drinking water regulations. Based on their support of other PFAS legislation, I think that these 2 senators can also come to an agreement on declaring all PFAS as hazardous substances eligible for cleanup under EPA Superfund law and mandating polluters undertake or pay for PFAS remediation. What's not clear at this moment and what needs to be resolved are things like ensuring that any entity that's discharging limited levels of PFAS receiving a Clean Water Act permit before discharging those chemicals into the environment, requiring the EPA to establish standards for the treatment of wastewater, which oftentimes includes PFAS chemicals before it's released into the environment. There's also a question about disposal of PFAS by incineration. And will that type of disposal meet Clean Air Act requirements? And then finally, I think there needs to be some agreement reached on liability protection. Right now, it's more questions than answers on who gets that protection. Is it water systems? Is it airports? Are there other entities that can get that liability protection? President Biden has made it very clear what his administration will do regarding PFAS contamination. This goes back to during his campaign when Biden included PFAS in his plan on environmental and economic opportunity. And on your screen is the excerpt from that plan where he says unequivocally they're going to tackle PFAS pollution by designating PFAS as hazardous substances. They're going to set enforceable limits of PFAS in Safe Drinking Water Act, and they're going to accelerate toxicity studies and research on PFAS. In 2019, EPA unveiled a PFAS action plan that included steps that the agency would take to address PFAS in order to protect public health. And the plan was updated in February of 2020. And after the transition to the new Biden administration, you can probably bet that this plan is going to be updated again. But in the meantime, the Biden administration continues implementing the EPA PFAS action plan. In fact, on the day that the Biden administration's nominee for EPA administrator, Michael Regan, was confirmed by the US Senate, on March 10, EPA issued 2 actions on PFAS. First, EPA issued a final regulatory determination for PFOA and PFAS, and EPA issued the 5th unregulated contaminant monitoring rule requiring water systems of certain size to collect samples for 29 additional PFAS substances over the next 12 months. Both of these actions will allow EPA to move forward to implement a national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFAS and consider further evaluation of additional PFAS chemicals. EPA also recently made available new testing data related to PFAS found in fluorinated containers. Now, Michael Regan has just been sworn in as the 16th administrator of the EPA. He is the former Secretary of North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and he comes to EPA with state-level experience dealing with PFAS substances. North Carolina, as many may know, is home to the Chemours plant that North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality required to cease discharge of Gen X and mitigate further contamination in the air and water surrounding the plant. Regan worked with North Carolina Attorney General in filing a lawsuit in 2020 against DuPont and Chemours for threats to human health from exposure to Gen X and other PFAS discharged into the Cape Fear River. And a settlement was reached in January 2021 for $4 billion. And what I find most interesting about this is all this occurred without federal regulations on maximum contaminant levels for PFAS. And, saying that, without federal regulations, states have started to implement their own regulations. On the left of your screen, under the picture, you can see the actions taken by state legislatures for the past 3 years on PFAS. During his confirmation hearing on February 3rd before the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Michael Regan made it clear to members of the Senate his intentions when it comes to PFAS regulations. Regan said PFAS compounds are going to be a top priority. He said we're going to pursue discharge limits, water quality values, and all avenues that we can while we are developing these rulemaking process. I don't think it could be more clear. As a former state environmental regulator, Regan has a passion for giving the proper signals to states so that they can take the appropriate actions. So as I wrap up here, when you take a look at the considerations of how Congress is currently functioning, the legislation that Congress has passed in previous sessions to address PFAS, the Biden administration signaling that PFAS regulatory action will be a high priority, you can conclude that the legislative and regulatory actions on PFAS in the 117th session of Congress is going to be vigorous. The Biden administration has already showed us that they intend to accelerate implementation of the EPA action plan and continue necessary steps to implement the national primary drinking water regulations, establish maximum contaminant levels for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water, designate PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances, research 29 other PFAS substances over the next 12 months, issue groundwater cleanup guidance for PFOA and PFAS, and develop toxicity values for Gen X and perfluorobutane sulfonate. Now, I believe Congress will also help EPA with legislative authorities that are needed and, the required funding levels that EPA are going to need through both the NDAA and the appropriations process. And I also think that Congress will act to ensure that those responsible for PFAS contamination must undertake or pay for PFAS remediation. Again, I'll leave it there. I appreciate sharing some of my thoughts with you on the legislative and the regulatory outlook of PFAS in the 117th session, and I look forward to your questions. Jason, back to you.
Thank you very much. And now, to conclude our webinar, Jennifer Bailey, VP of Business Development at Sanexen, will describe ALTRA's ultimate approach to current PFAS challenges. With a background in chemical engineering and business strategy, Jennifer has over 20 years of industrial experience and an in-depth expertise in the field of water technology. Jennifer also brings with her a unique perspective, having spearheaded market and commercial alignment strategies, as well as technological developments for use in the pulp and paper, mining and chemical refining industries, focusing on utilities, influent water, and wastewater management. At Sanexen Environmental Services, Jennifer works closely with the environmental team to define and implement a solid business development plan that will see the next generation of water technology, proven lead-free, and PFAS solutions installed in cities and towns who are urgently facing deteriorating water main infrastructure challenges all across North America. Madam Bailey, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here. So it's clear that there will be increasing focus on PFAS levels in industrial discharge and drinking water. So let's take a look at our approach for the PFAS challenge. Over the past few years, as PFAS concerns are increasing, there are several recurring challenges that our industrial and municipal clients are facing. How do they prepare for these more stringent PFAS regulations that are coming? How can they address significant PFAS concentrations in their discharge or their water? How can they efficiently and economically treat these high concentrations? And what can they do if their current treatment approach is not keeping up with the evolving standards? PFAS is a multi-component problem with many variables, and it can be overwhelming for the operator. It is not a one-size-fits-all problem. The combination of risk, budget constraints, water variability, and resourcing requires a novel approach to solve this problem, particularly for highly contaminated situations. We have to think differently, because for high contamination situations, rarely is PFAS treatment solved by a single filter. It's often a combination of processes. So what is the ALTRA approach to the PFAS challenge? Well, as Martin described, we leverage decades of environmental remediation expertise to determine the best treatment approach for our clients. Our risk and assessment and ecotoxicology teams quantify the severity of the contamination, they assess the current state of treatment technologies, and they identify the client's risks. Then our engineering and R&D teams select the right technologies that would provide the optimum approach and deploy the solution to the client's site. Throughout this process, the economics of the solution remains paramount. Yep, thanks. As I mentioned on the previous page, economics remains a focus for our teams. To date, our ALTRA PFAS solutions have demonstrated significant economies when treating highly contaminated waters versus the industry standard approaches. This is where our ALTRA PFAS technologies shine. So, when should you consider ULTRA PFAS solutions? When you're faced with tough to treat PFAS contamination, or when your operating costs are escalating and your current equipment is no longer effective to treat the PFAS to the required levels. Our containerized ULTRA PFAS solution approach makes these units mobile, easy to install and start up, as well as scalable to handle the highest flow rates. Finally, we package the solution to include operating and maintenance of the units in order to reduce impact on our clients' personnel. In summary, our ULTRA PFAS solutions are the results of combining decades of experience in water technologies, environmental site remediation, risk assessment, and ecotoxicology, and as well as leveraging our operational expertise for deployment. To close, finding treatment solutions for our customers to PFAS and other contaminants that are quick, effective, and affordable is what motivates and drives our teams. And on that, I'd like to close out the seminar and turn it over to a Q&A discussion. Thanks, Jason.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so we had a few questions come up on the chat, which is great. The first one I have is for Martin, actually. I'm asked, how large a flow rate can you treat, Martin?
Examples we've shown here were ranging between 50 to 100 gallons per minute. We certainly can go much higher than that. We've proven to be able to treat millions of gallons a day. It depends really on the water, but we don't see limitations within those range, 1,000 gallons perhaps. Above that, this is not an approach at this point in time for a large water treatment plant for a large city. It's really for, like I referred to, the chemical soup, which hopefully no one is treating in a water treatment plant. Hope it answers the question.
I think so, yes. I have another one for you, actually, while you're here. Dr. Bureau, is your technology affected by metals in the water, hydrocarbons, saline, pH?
So the short answer is no. Obviously, everything is in the detail. We need to analyze the water. It's difficult to say a 100% no, but as far as what we've seen and what we've tested with millions of liters treated, we don't see an important effect with metals, with isolene, with lower or higher pH, perhaps not extreme, but it doesn't have to be neutral. No, not an issue. Neither oil and grease, by the way. It could be in the water. It doesn't affect our treatment in opposition to GAC or resins, for example.
Okay, and is your technology based on absorption or adsorption? And how do you explain your claim of higher PFAS capture capacity or reduced frequency of filter changes?
Yeah, interesting question. So we do have our few secrets, but it is an absorption, AB process. And because of that, it leads to orders of magnitude higher in terms of absorption capacity when compared to GAC, which is the standard. Without a doubt, it's going to absorb way more, 10 times more, perhaps 50 times more, for sure. Yeah.
Very well, thank you. Now a question for Mr. Cansler. You mentioned the cloture rule in the U.S. Senate. Do you believe the Senate will significantly change or eliminate the filibuster?
No, I don't believe senators are ready to eliminate the filibuster. First, there's Democratic Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona. They do not support eliminating the filibuster. And I think second, there are many senators who have been around quite a while in the Senate, and they've been in both the majority and minority parties. And they know that that filibuster provides protection for either party who finds themselves in the minority. So, based on those very large reasons, I don't see them eliminating the filibuster.
Okay, and do you know the latest number of military installations across the U.S. with known contamination or suspected discharges of PFAS?
The Department of Defense in April of last year, that number was at 651, I believe. And then they added more installations in September. And I think they're currently just above 700 military sites with known or suspected PFAS contamination.
Okay, and I have another one for you, Mr. Cansler. What is your best guess for a timeline of EPA promulgating national primary drinking water regulations for PFAS?
That's a very good question and a difficult one to answer. Like pretty much all other regulations, it's going to be dependent upon the number and merit of lawsuits that are filed and how long it takes to litigate those lawsuits. With PFOA and PFAS, I think that EPA can move pretty quickly. Some are saying by the end of this year. And I think maybe for other PFAS, the 29 that they're just now, unveiling and researching more, I think that's going to require a little bit more time. It could be, anywhere from 2 to 4 years. That's my best guess.
Great. Well, it looks like that's it. Actually, if you have further questions, you go ahead and answer, or rather ask them on the chat, even beyond this presentation now, and our experts will be glad to answer them for you. So thank you very much, Martin Bureau, Tim Cansler, and Jennifer Bailey for these in-depth presentations. For those watching, I hope you learned as much as I did, and thank you kindly for joining the conversation. I'm Jason Rohde from NOMADLive.tv for Sanexen, wishing you a great rest of your day.